Good afternoon, good evening, everyone across the Zoom dome and around the world. Welcome to the second event in the African Literature Association's lecture series. My name is Adeleke Adeeko. I teach comparative literature and African cinema at Indiana University, Bloomington, and I coordinate this series with my colleagues, Grima Negash, president of the association, and Matt Brown of the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I also like to acknowledge the support of James McCockle with publicity for the lecture. Unlike the last month's event, which was a lecture, today's event is a multi-person outing. It's a roundtable, due largely to the generosity of the person heading the roundtable, Professor Moradewun Adejunmobi. Before going to introduce Professor Adejunmobi, who in turn introduce her co-speakers, I'll say a few quick words about the lecture series as I did the last time, which is to say that it's an initiative by the current Executive Council of the Association to engage publicly its members' interest and to generate even more interest among others. And that will make them join the association. So to our steady members, thank you for your long-standing and continuing dedication. And to those who are just getting interested in the association, we hope that your interest will be rewarded with these lectures and that you in turn reward that association with your sustained attention and membership. Professor Moradewun Adejunmobi is Professor of African and African American Studies at the University of California, Davis, California, and a prominent leader in the fields of African literary and cultural studies. She is a leader in the true sense of that word. After having played a decisive, though hardly acknowledged role in bringing visibility to the study of African literature, cinema, and other emergent cultural forms in the past decade and a half. The last time I had the honor of introducing Professor Adejunmobi, this was during the second FAGWA conference in August 2019 in Akure, Ondo State, Nigeria. Her friend and colleague, Tejumola Olaniyan, was still alive. In the course of that introduction, I remarked, and I'm quoting myself, pardon me, that Adejunmobi, like Tejumola Olaniyan and Adeleke Adeeko, had stayed at the forefront of dedication to service in associations like Modern Language Association, MLA, the African Studies Association, and especially the African Literature Association, where she was most recently the vice president and the president, end of quote. Since then, as we all know, Professor Olaniyan has sadly passed on, and Moradewun has selflessly stepped up to fill one of his positions, that of the editor-in-chief of the Journal of African Literature Association, which we call JALA for short. Today's event originated from her service in that respect. The roundtable is titled, "Why Wasn't My Article Published?" And Moradewun Adejunmobi has brought together a group of colleagues associated with journals in the field of African literature and cultural studies to respond to what is clearly not a rhetorical question. The participants they join us from different parts of the world, from African world, from Nairobi or Kisumu, Kenya that is, and Johannesburg. So in other words, this is both a virtual event, it's also a global event. The event is streamed live, as you know, and if you follow JALA handle on Twitter, you will see live tweet as well. As always, there will be a Q&A at the end of the session, after the speakers have had their turn. So attendees are encouraged to put up their questions and comments in the comment section of the channel. We will do our best to respond to them live and later. Over to you, Moradewun.
Good morning from California, good afternoon and good evening to all of you who are joining us on the live stream from around the world. My name, as Professor Adeeko has just said, is Moradewun Adejunmobi. I am editor-in-chief of the Journal of the African Literature Association. I'm also a member of the editorial board of the Journal of African Cultural Studies, in addition to serving on a number of other boards. Let me just start very quickly by introducing all the members of our panel, of our roundtable today. First up, I'd like to introduce Professor Adeleke Peterson from the University of Witwatersrand, who is a member of the Editorial Advisory Board of the Journal of the African Literature Association, and also serves on the board of the Journal of African Cinemas. We will see his face later on, but I just want to mention his name right now. Thank you very much for joining us, Becky. Next, I'd like to introduce Professor Juliana Nfah-Abbenyi from North Carolina State University. She's a member of the Editorial Advisory Board of the Journal of the African Literature Association and a member of the Advisory Board of Contemporary Women's Writing. Thank you very much. We will see her face later as well. Next is Dr. Tom Odhiambo from the University of Nairobi, who is a founding editor of the East African Journal of Literary and Cultural Studies. Thank you again for joining us from Kenya. And finally, last but not least, is Professor Adeleke Adeeko of Ohio State University. He's the associate editor of Research in African Literatures and a member of the Editorial Advisory Board of the Journal of the African Literature Association. I would like to start by saying a few words regarding our roundtable, and then I will call upon each member of the roundtable one by one to share their thoughts on the questions that we want to look at. This event contributes to a conversation around decolonizing knowledge, which involves what we read, what we teach, and what gets published in the scholarly record as academic books and as articles. We're having this conversation amongst ourselves and with you who are joining us as scholars who work specifically in African literary and cultural studies. Let me hasten to say that we are not speaking as representatives for a journal, for any given journal. So please don't go later, don't write later to a particular journal and say, you know, Professor Adeeko said whatever he said, and therefore you have to accept my article, you know, or Professor Nfah-Abbenyi said something during this roundtable, and therefore you have to accept my article. No, each one of them is speaking from their experience, and they're sharing their own thoughts on the topic. We're addressing the question, why wasn't my article published, from two perspectives. The perspectives of the would-be author who's wondering why their article was not published, why it was sent for revision, why it was rejected. We're also addressing the question from the perspective of the peer reviewer and editor, wondering whether the way in which we evaluate articles, manuscripts, does not end up shutting out scholars from outside North America and Europe in particular. Increasingly from our individual experience, we realize that there are uneven perceptions about what constitutes acceptable scholarly writing around the world, and maybe in particular from the African continent. At the same time, we want to participate in helping to foster journals that can compete with the best journals around the world. All journals, as you know, that have a peer review process receive more articles than they can possibly publish. So we do have to choose. How do we choose? I will say for now that the peer review process is an invitation to dialogue. A dialogue between the author and the journal. There may be a few people in the world, a few geniuses in the world, who have never been in a situation where an article that they wrote was sent back to them for revision or even rejected. I'm not one of those geniuses. My articles have frequently attracted, you know, a comment, a recommendation for revision, for modification. And I take that as an invitation to dialogue. There's something I'm trying to say that someone on the other end is not quite perceiving. I need to go back and rethink how I am saying what it is that I am saying. And it's in this light that I think of the peer review process as an invitation to dialogue. I'm sure that my colleagues on the roundtable also have their own opinions about the peer review process and how we should approach the peer review process. And also what we should think about how we are carrying out this work and whether it disadvantages authors from particular locations around the world. Having said that, it's already 10 minutes past. I want to open the roundtable up. First of all, I'm going to go to Adeleke Peterson from South Africa and ask him to share his thoughts on the questions for the roundtable. So Becky, up to you.
Okay, good evening, everyone from Johannesburg, and thanks for the invitation. So since time is tight, I'll just share some of my thoughts on the matter. Depending on how we go, I think my take, or what I think could be a productive way of addressing the range of important questions would be firstly to maybe look at, from my experience, whether as an editorial board member or as an assessor, the kinds of factors that I take into consideration in the assessment of the article. And then later on, then try and maybe complicate these by looking at some of the contextual matters that pertain to the politics of knowledge or the production of knowledge that become central in how these two parts often sort of articulate. So the first part would be basically fairly standard, observations, and I had particularly younger scholars in mind in terms of some of the issues that they need to take into consideration when preparing the work for submission and when having to reread it in the light of comments. And it's the usual stuff that, the article must advance an argument or a discussion that makes a contribution to knowledge. And I think often that kind of, premise, I think, tends to be overcomplicated, I think, by younger scholars. And then in the attempt to search for originality. And I think originality often is sort of best sort of dealt with in a sort of a nuanced and layered manner. And just to accept that originality can take one of two forms. Firstly, it could just be the presentation of sort of new empirical material or research. And this material could have been arrived at through archival research, and especially in literary and cultural studies. I think newspapers, unpublished material, reports, and so on are quite rich sources. It could be the results of interviews. It could be the results of participation in sort of performance-based practices or processes. So there's a wide range of ways in which one can generate empirical data. Then the second way in which one can work with originality is by thinking of it as sort of rethinking or thinking through concepts in new or distinctive or sort of provocative ways. And often here, what one looks for is whether sort of dominant ways of knowing and thinking are either sort of contested, reformulated, or even sort of rejected. But then one needs to get a clear sense of what the basis of those kinds of interventions are. I mean, they could be theoretical, they could be historical, they could be aesthetic. So there could be many other catalysts that spark this need to get us to rethink what the state of the discipline or the field is. But that presupposes that, of course, that the author must have a solid foundational knowledge, a solid knowledge of both the historical and contemporary state of the field that undergirds the argument that is being presented. Then a number of other issues in terms that now speak to how the argument is elaborated. I think the argument in terms of the article must, and I'll just mention these, a number of key things for me, sort of state a concise and clear focus or central argument. And my preference, because all of these things are not just simply objective and scientific, my preference, it tends to be towards work that is slanted or tilted towards being more analytical rather than being descriptive. Now, that's sometimes a very difficult balance to achieve, especially I think for authors from traditions or locations where the central text that they are working with are not canonical or well known. So often there's still a need to map, there's still a need to provide the scaffolding that will inform the argument. So description, in a sense, is it's not always unavoidable. Then I'm also tend to suggest that work that is based on texts or that is based on case studies must avoid reducing the texts or case studies to be merely illustrative of sort of priorly established theoretical or ideological readings or positions. And I think sometimes what tends to happen is sometimes scholars can feel to be under the pressure in order, for instance, to indicate that they are up to date and cutting edge, that texts then just are put to the service of whatever is seen as being the current sort of dominant perspectives that are prevailing. So in some ways, sometimes I think authors, especially younger scholars from the continent, still feel the need to demonstrate what I call the right to speak. And that obviously implies an apprenticeship of all the ideas that, are usually from the North, et cetera, et cetera. Then the other thing that's important for me that is also crucial is the issues then that pertain to the structure and the style in which the argument is then presented. So again, one can't be prescriptive, because I think particular arguments may be best served by particular ways in which of formulating and presenting them in sort of informal terms. But essentially the argument must unfold in a logical and comprehensible manner. So there are many possible structures for this, but it is best, my feeling is always, if it is informed by and consistent with both the arguments being presented and the text or case studies that are being focused on. And then also, so in a sense, the author must consider which structure will best serve the argument. Will it be a chronological or sequential structure, especially if the argument is going to require some kind of historical contextualization or grounding? Will it be a structure that will be organized around sort of thematic or aesthetic concerns? Or is it a structure that's more interested in utilizing what one would call a kind of comparative paradigm? And one of the two other issues, which again are very standard, that are important sometimes to remind authors, is obviously that the aim, the introduction often shouldn't just be seen in the kind of bland sense as an introduction, but it's about in what ways do you indicate, again, concisely and provocatively, the kind of aims and intentions of the study and its argument or arguments. And similarly, that the conclusion shouldn't just be a re-summary of the argument that's been presented. But how do you, weave together the different elements that have formed the key components of your presentation? And how do you make sure that these, and how do you indicate the significance of these key threads that, in a sense, that inform the argument that you've been making? So you should try and get beyond the question of just simply being a summary. Now, to quickly shift, am I running out of time?
Yes, you are. So if you could say one or two other things, we'll move on to the next person. Thank you.
Yeah. Then in terms of style, there's two main issues. Basically, it's obvious, I think, the accessibility of the argument that's presented, and also the kind of a structure that sort of combines into a coherent whole. And I think one of the key and difficult things often is because your paragraphs or your sections in some senses are discrete. How do you help the reader to be able to transition between the new lines of thought or new directions in your thinking? And how do you signpost this or plant seeds in the reader so that they're able to move along with the logic of your argument? So I'll stop at that. The issues around the politics of knowledge production, how something as simple as this becomes complicated based on where we're reading from, where we're thinking from, and who we think our primary audience is that we're addressing.
Thank you very much, Becky. Lots to think about there. Originality, the right to speak, the politics of location. I'm going to call on Juliana now to share her thoughts regarding the main questions that we're debating here today. So Juliana, over to you.
Thank you, and hello, everyone. Becky has made so many points, and in the interest of not repeating some of the things that he has said, because most of the things that he has brought up are some of the things that I was also thinking about. So I will not repeat some of the things that he was talking about. I might just go into examples to extend some of the points that he has been making. Usually when I read a manuscript, I read the manuscript for clarity. I read it for coherence, consistency, all the things that Becky was mentioning. What is the contribution to the field that this manuscript is making available to me, the reviewer, or to the reader who might read the article when it is published? And so one of the things that Becky talked about was how do people use concepts in their papers? I'll give us an example of how in an introduction, someone might say in their paper might introduce a number of terms or theoretical concepts. For instance, they might introduce 3 different terms like Afropolitanism, Afrofuturism, and African futurism. So those 3 terms are introduced in the introduction. And when I continue reading the essay, I expect to see the various ways in which these terms and concepts are being used to make points, to read the text. However, sometimes we see these terms used in the introduction or the first 2 pages of an article, and then they are forgotten completely in the rest of the essay. And it doesn't give one a full picture of why these terms were brought up in the first place. Sometimes these terms might be brought up in the introduction, and then because the author doesn't give clear definitions of the terms, they might end up just using these terms interchangeably in the essay. And that becomes problematic because these 3 words are not, synonymous. they mean very specific things, and an author can actually bring new meanings to the terms that they had in the introduction. I'll use African futurism as a good example. Nnedi Okorafor, who coined this term, she has defined the term, and she clearly talks about the term as a mode of writing, the ways in her writing, this is what, how this term really captures what she writes about. And she makes it very clear how African futurism is different and from Afrofuturism. It might be connected to it, but it's also very different. And one other thing that she does in her definition of the term, she says, African futurism is one word, and the futurism in African futurism is a lowercase, it's a lowercase f, it's not a capital letter F. So if I'm reading an essay and someone has introduced Afropolitanism, you know, and Afrofuturism, and African futurism in the essay, and when you see the word at the first time, it's African futurism, the way Nnedi spells it. But then later on in the essay, you begin to find that an author might actually split the word. You would have African and futurism as two words and not one word. When I see that the term has been split, because when Nnedi talks about this word, it's both a term and a concept. So when an author splits the term and makes it into two words, my expectation would be, this author is moving beyond or is redefining African futurism. And so when you split the term and you don't explain why you are now saying African futurism as two words instead of one word, it doesn't really clarify how you're using the term. And I think more often than not, that's where an author might run into problems, in the sense that they don't clarify the theoretical terms that they are using to explicate their literary text. It would be helpful when someone moves from African futurism as one word to African futurism as two words, to say, I know that Nnedi says this about this term that she coined, but I want to give I want to add a new meaning to the term. And this is the meaning that I'm adding to the term because it gives me a better way of reading the text that I am presenting in this essay, you know. So I would hope that, you know, authors would be mindful of those little deviations that happen along as they are writing the essay, that it's not always clear what they infer with a theoretical term at a particular point in the essay that they are writing. It's something that they need to pay attention to. And so one of the questions that you asked us to think about was, what factors would lead me to recommend a manuscript for significant revision? That's one of the things that I would bring up. For instance, if I'm asking for a revision, I would ask the author to clarify their theoretical terms. And the more they clarify the terms, the more they don't fall into the trap of using different terms interchangeably as if they were synonyms when they really were not synonyms. And of course, every journal has their writing style. Some use the MLA style, some use the Chicago style. I would have to say that, you know, if there are too many stylistic problems with the essay, that would be one of the things that I would say, you know, this journal uses this style. Please pay a little bit attention and be consistent. Sometimes it's not that the authors are not using the right writing style. Sometimes it is that they are not consistent with the ways in which they are using the same style within an essay, so that they might use MLA style, and then the next reference within the text, they will use Chicago. The next one, they will use something else. All you are asking for is consistency, so that even if you are not respecting, let's say, for instance, a journal says their style is MLA, and the author is only used to Chicago style. What I'm saying is, if they begin to use that Chicago style, they should be consistent with it throughout, because it makes it easier, to correct, sometimes the journal might actually keep that style if one is consistent with it from the beginning to the end. It is when at one point one is doing MLA and the next point they are doing Chicago that becomes problematic. Keep it to one style and then be consistent with it throughout. Another important point is the point of what do you bring to the, what are you contributing, to the field. It's very important to think about the fact that one's manuscript is actually contributing something to the field. And I think Becky talked a lot about that in the opening statement. Yeah, that having a contribution to the field is very helpful. And some of the ways in which one can speak to how one's work is a new contribution is actually by talking about the work that has gone before. This person did this person did this with this person did this with this, and what I'm doing is I'm moving this discussion in this new direction. It's very helpful in that sense because, and if you're the first person who is doing this work, you need to say that no one has done this. This is the first time that work is being done on this, and this is what I want to do with this essay right here and now. And there is no, one shouldn't hold back in saying, I'm the first person doing this work. You don't have to pretend and say, oh, someone did this, and no, you don't have to pretend. If you are the first person who is doing this work, have at it, just come out and say it. No one has done this. This is the first time that work is being done on this, and here we go, So, I mean, how the essay contributes to knowledge in the field also matters in how one decides on, whether the essay should be accepted or not. Of course, it's always really difficult to reject someone's article. It's really a difficult thing to do. However, sometimes authors don't make it easy on the reviewers, because if the essay is poorly written and if it doesn't contribute anything new to the field, what else is the reviewer supposed to say? I mean, they would say all those things. It's not a new contribution to the field. It's poorly written and all of that. And if it was bringing a new contribution, but it was poorly written, then people can be given comments on how to revise it and make the paper better. But when it is no contribution, when it's poorly written, it becomes very difficult. And I think authors think that it's easy for reviewers to reject an article. I think reviewers take a lot of time to write, comments and say, do this to make your essay better, So if they take all of that time, it means that really it's difficult for them to say reject it, but sometimes that's just what, someone has to recommend, that an essay be rejected. And
so Juliana, I'm going to ask you to round up in a minute.
Okay. Okay. Hopefully, if an essay is rejected and the rejection comes with comments, that the author can actually use those comments to, make the paper better so that they can then resubmit. I mean, resubmitting essays is something that is valuable to do, take the time, look at the comments, do the revisions, and then resubmit the essay, especially when there are a lot of proofreading errors, stylistic and proofreading errors in the essay. Share your essay with someone else, let them look at it, because sometimes you've looked at an essay so many times that you miss clear mistakes that are there. Share it with someone else, they'll pick up those proofreading errors, and then, you can resubmit the essay. Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much. Juliana had a lot to say about consistency, or rather inconsistency in deployment of and theories and inconsistency in adopting the style, the style for a journal. So we'll come back to those points later on. Thank you so much. I'm going to go on now to Tom in Kenya. So over to you, Tom, now.
Thank you very much. I don't know. I mean, I think that I won't repeat. I'll say I won't repeat a lot of the stuff that my teacher, Becky, has actually raised at the beginning and have been highlighted again. I think I want to speak about just three things. First of all, I want to offer a caveat. And the caveat is that I can say confidently from a very personal background that nobody tells people who are starting out in their early careers, nobody tells them that the intellectual economy is an economy nevertheless. It's a competition. Nobody says that. Nobody tells you in your graduate class, because we all at sometimes fall in love with our professors, and our professors kind of help us to kind of put through an article or two. And once they have babysitters, you know, we kind of think we are confident. Like all kids, you know, you start your baby steps and you start falling, and it can be tragic. So nobody ever tells you that an intellectual economy is an economy like the rest of them. There's competition, there's hierarchies. There is actually somebody is gonna look at your piece and say, oh, but I'm working in this area, and then start saying, do you know that I'm working in this area? And that becomes a story for another day. But the key thing about all papers that are ever submitted is that they are exposed to public scrutiny, whether the public is just the editor and one or two reviewers. You can't do, I love these young men I meet every now and then, and I ask them, what do you do? They say, I'm a poet. And I ask them, oh, I've never read your poetry. Where are these poems? They say, I'm a closet poet. It's a wonderful contradiction. You can never be a closet intellectual, because by saying you're an intellectual, you're making a public declaration. And if you make a public declaration, you will have to accept that people will read your work and say, I'm not convinced. What's the point I'm making? I think all editors always ask, what's the argument you're making? And there's too many papers. There's just too many papers that are submitted to journals that do not make an argument from the front, from page one, from the first sentence. I mean, you're gonna read 3 pages before this person says, okay, the point of this paper is this. I mean, it's just so boring, it's tiring. And sometimes I ask people, when I'm mentoring young people, I tell them, can you read newspapers? You know, newspapers are very upfront. There's no space. I mean, the copies is competing with advertisement. Maybe we should introduce advertisement in our journals full scale and say, we're looking for money. We don't want your article unless your article can compete with the advertisement. Advertisements are quite upfront. This is skin lightening cream. It will make you brown, full stop. So you go and try it. Academic arguments begin, somebody begins by saying, in this essay, I'm doing a comparative reading of Achebe and Soyinka, or Ngugi and Bukenya. And 10 pages in, there is no comparison. Somebody has kind of veered off the track, has fallen in love with his arguments about Ngugi, and it's going on about Ngugi. And then at the end, they say, nevertheless, I think there's a point to compare Ngugi and Bukenya. I mean, nobody likes to be cheated, especially if you have to read academic arguments, which can be all over the place in terms of nowadays the sexiness of postmodernist language. Every young scholar around wants to appear like they can invent the latest terms, or they can replay the oldest term in the book and reintroduce it to us who didn't know it. Editors are always on the lookout for new things, yes, but not new things that lose the track of the argument. So the first thing I think that really helps people to evaluate manuscripts, from my experience, is I always look for the argument. I had a colleague at Wits University called Robert Mponde, and he had a wonderful phrase. He used to say, Tom, for as long as the article is written well enough to communicate, you have invited a conversation. We can disagree about other things, but it should essentially communicate. And the way it communicates is that it poses an argument. And so throughout the essay, I need to keep track. I think Becky was talking about the consistency of the logic in the argument. And this, a lot of young people, a lot of academics who are getting into writing, publishing, keep on forgetting, what's the argument of your essay? And newspaper editors know this well in advance. Academic editors have known this since day one, actually. So they look for the argument, it's not there. And then they look for, if it is there, they will look for whether it is actually communicated. Like I just said, a proposition is made, but that proposition is not followed through. Why? Because this person does not remember that at the end of the day, you are trying to provoke a conversation. Actually, the original idea of the thesis is that what you say, the other person should not agree with it. They should say, but why are you saying this? So reviewers do not need to agree at all with anything you submit. In fact, if they all agree with it, there is something very fishy there. They should disagree with what you're saying to an extent in order to provoke a conversation. I think the third thing that I really want to say, and which has been spoken about twice, and I think I'll let it go so that we get into Q&A, is the style. Style is the key thing in any form of writing, style. What is your style? Let's forget the in-house style of the journal, because that you can actually do very quickly. The reviewers will say, follow the APA or MLA, and you'll do that. But the style of your writing is so, so important. I think this needs to be taught at graduate level all the time. I used to do workshops on this, and when you tell people style, they'll say, what do you mean? And I would start off by saying, if I say style, the first thing that should come to your mind is the language. What language have you adopted? Lawyers have their language. Priests have their language. Educators have their language. You as an academic, what's the language you have adopted to use? I think Becky spoke a little about this. But so take a case, somebody is writing a piece that is actually historical in tone and mood, but their style ignores that. How do you write a piece that references a lot from history? And this is about going back to figure out, if you're writing about a particular subject, how does the subject condition the language you use and therefore the style you use? I really just wanted to highlight this so that I don't repeat a lot of things, but I must repeat that there's too many safe articles. I mean, safe in the sense that they are written just to make sure that they get through the process. And I think a lot of editors turn them down because the reason they are safe is that they do not provoke anything. So the readers come back and say, exactly what are you saying? And a lot of the individuals who submit such articles get really annoyed. How can they not see what I'm saying? And what I've discovered when you review what the reviewers have said, you realize that there's no argument made from the first paragraph. I think we need to provoke the reader, any reader, whether it's the reviewers or whoever will read this article later, from the word go. And the way we do that is to adopt a style that reminds this person that this essay is worth reading. I think I want to stop there so that others can speak and this conversation can go on in Q&A if we have the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tom. Lots there to think about. The intellectual, exposing themselves to public scrutiny, the article making its argument clear from the very first page, thinking about an article in the way thinking about the way in which information is presented in an article compared to the way in which information is presented in a newspaper, not meandering, not waiting until page 14 of a 20-page article to declare your argument, being provocative, not advancing a safe kind of argument. Thank you very much for all of that. Finally, I'm going to go to Adeleke Adeeko and ask him to share his own thoughts before I say one or two things, and then we open it up for Q&A. So over to you, Adeleke Adeeko.
Thank you for asking me to join this discussion. I'll be quick and try to address all the 4 questions that were sent to us. One, how do you evaluate manuscripts? That people have already responded to that adequately, and I'll just reiterate in one sentence. Whether the manuscript does what it says it is going to do is, for me, the basis of deciding whether to recommend revisions or not. Does the article do what it promises to do, if it promises anything? If it doesn't promise anything, what's the point? But if it promises something and then does it, then we go from there, which affirms what Tom Odhiambo said earlier. I'll then go to the next question, since we have already, most of us responded very well, and we share the same, there's a consensus around evaluation. What are the major issues in journal publication for African literary and cultural studies? That's the second question I got, which I think is a major difficulty today. My one-word answer is longevity. There are too many Adeeko journals, born to die journals on the continent. They are countless. Too many volume 1, number 1 titles. You look at the CV, this volume 1, number 1, no number 2. Volume 1, you just see so many of them, they come and die, they come and die. I think that's a major issue for publication, journal publication on the continent. Of course, many non-editorial factors, besides quality of research, are responsible for that Adeeko syndrome, born to die. One of them is weak institutional support, either in funding or personnel, weak peer review process, poor production processes, and weak distribution, which has to be corrected. To refer to the Nigerian case that I know better, there was a point about 5 years ago, the Nigerian University Commission said that to go for promotion, so you must list your journal published internationally, as if there is a local that is not international. If it's international in Cotonou, Columbus, Ohio is international in Canada. So, but these are institutional matters that we have to pay attention to. My experience with Savannah Review in Ilorin, Kwara State University, and West Africa Review, even here in the US, tells me that African institutions, we must devote the necessary resources. African journals they are resource intensive, especially personnel, which we must be willing to contribute or to give. The third question, what can scholars in African literary and cultural studies do to ensure that the peer review process does not end up reinforcing global imbalances? I'm of 2 minds here. Global South is varied. Global South is very, very varied. And I think Becky Peterson mentioned that earlier. South Africa is not Nigeria. Brazil is not Togo. Even within each country, vast differences do occur. Ibadan is not, University of Ibadan is not the Taisho College of Education at Ijebu-Ode, just 30 miles away. Shang University is not Yaoundé University. Yaoundé is not Shang. These are 2 different universities. Contributors need to know that journal readers do not care where the author is located. They do not care. I don't care where you are located. And like many people I know, the important thing for them is, to the editor, is readership. The reason there is no field in which there is only one journal is that if the peer review in one journal closes the door, you go to another journal. That's why I said I'm of 2 minds on the Global South. When the author is urged to revise and resubmit, malice, ignorance, or some other imperialism blindness, or worse still, intellectual ignorance should not be assumed. Don't assume it. Don't assume imperialist blindness. Don't assume intellectual ignorance on their part. Don't assume that they are malicious against the global South. If you have your argument, you're clear with it, go to the next journal. There are many others. That is the only way to correct imbalance, as far as I know. There was a time, actually not too long ago, when publishing in the Journal of the Historical Society of Nigeria is a sure sign if you want to be an African historian, wherever you are located. It doesn't matter. The journal in which a scholar wants his or her work published cannot, by definition, represent insurmountable barriers. If you want your work to appear there, then it's not an insurmountable barrier for you. Then the last question, so that we can move on to disclosure concerns. Can we maintain something that we call standards and be fair to scholars everywhere in the world? My answer is emphatically yes, even if they are unwritten. I have an emphatic, in the minimum, the journal to which a scholar sends a manuscript ought to be a publication whose contents one has read or one you wish to read. If you don't want to read in that journal, if you have not read it, what's the point? That means you're already familiar with what they do. Be familiar with that standard before you send anything to them. Standards in quote, whichever way you regard it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adeleke, and for keeping to time. In fact, not using all of your time, which gives us a little bit more time to advance into the Q&A. You have pointed out a number of things, the phenomenon of having journals that have a very short life that we see on the African continent. Does an article do what it says it was going to do? And if it does not, what's the point? You've pointed out that the global South is varied. And I think you made a very important point towards the end, which is that if one journal closes the door, you can always try another journal. You can always try another journal. And in fact, this is something that has happened to me, that I've been asked to revise an article in certain ways. I've taken on the revisions, and then I've thought of submitting the article to a different journal, which then subsequently accepted the article. So, and this goes back to what I said at the very beginning, when I said that the peer review process is an invitation to dialogue. It's an invitation to have an exchange between the author and the peer reviewers. So one should respond in good faith to the comments that are made, to the suggestions that are made, rather than just dismissing them. I'll add one or two things myself in just 4 or 5 minutes before handing back to Akin Adeeko to lead the Q&A portion of our roundtable. And I want to speak about theory. And I think everybody who has spoken today thus far on the roundtable has made some brief reference to the notion of theory. And I think theory works in different ways depending on where people are located and in the way in which they deploy theory in their academic writing, or they attempt to deploy theory in their academic writing. One thing I see is some authors who, whatever the latest theory that is popular is, they're going to throw it in there, whether or not they themselves have fully digested the theory and know how to apply it to any particular context or situation. This is something that is immediately visible to a peer reviewer. So that's one problem. They know the theory. They deploy the theory because it's new. In another instance, thinking about literary and cultural studies, an author may actually be very familiar with a given theory, but not familiar with the work that they are supposedly trying to apply the theory to. So knowing the theory then displaces knowing the text. That's something also that a peer reviewer is going to pick up. In other instances, we see scholars who know what particular critics from their own country have written about a theory, but they haven't themselves familiarized themselves with what the leading figures who have advocated that theory have said. That too is a problem. You really need to be aware of what has been said about a particular theory from around the world. One thing that I see, which really I find disheartening, is individuals send articles to journals in African studies. And for example, they want to talk about, let's just say, environmental issues, or they want to talk about feminism, or they want to talk about translation, or they want to talk about other things. And they know what different scholars have said about that framework, but they don't know what anybody working in African literary and cultural studies has said about it. And I'm thinking, you're trying to publish in a journal of African studies, and you don't know what anybody working in African studies has said about that theory, how they've deployed it, what their criticism has been of that theory, how they've used it. Why are you submitting your article to a journal of African studies? In all such instances, I tell the author, please go back and find out what people working in African studies have said about this. What have they said about environmental issues? What have they said about post-colonial theory? What have they said about, other theoretical frameworks? We can't just bypass what scholars in African studies have said about a particular theory and then expect to be published in a journal that focuses specifically on African studies. I see that as a big gap, a big shortcoming in terms of the kinds of submissions that we are receiving today. I think I'm going to stop there. There are many other things I could say, but maybe they will come up in the Q&A. And at this point, I'm going to hand over back to Akin Adeeko to see if we have any questions that have come up, and we'll take it from there.
All right, well, thank you, everyone. This is actually a very interesting and frequently funny presentation. So thank you very much. It's really quite enriching and also very, very informative in specific ways. There are just very many issues here, and I am, and I hope you are too, pleased with the kind of consistency that sort of come through in terms of how the different speakers have presented their arguments. And so I assume that this will be very interesting for people to pitch in. There are no general comments yet, no questions in the chat that I can find. I see general greetings from Addis, from Kampala, which are very interesting. Gives us an indication of where people are logging in from. So that's good. But I do just think that I might ask a general question to start off, and while you're off fighting or playing with the question, people will ask more. And so the question has to do with and I think it's also very interesting that you touched upon it, but it was started off by Becky, the question of the politics of location, which is really very important. We cannot avoid it. Zoom has made location problematic in certain times, but in fact, it has only reinforced that in other times as well. By which I mean that people are in from Uganda, from California, all sorts of places now, and we can actually talk together in real time. But that really hasn't addressed the question that, with the exception of Journal of African Cinemas, that all the journals that are here, and of course, East African Literary Studies, that a good number of the journals that are in our field, not just African literature, literary and cultural studies, but also in African history, especially in African history, which actually, as Professor Adeeko mentioned, the Journal of Historical Studies, Studies of Nigeria used to be the prime place for most historians, including so-called Western historians. But all of that has disappeared. We know the reason, and I don't think we need to reprise that. But I just want you panelists to find a way of responding to this in terms of the relationship between these politics of location and how it shapes the way in which scholars, not just young scholars, but also fairly established scholars who are hoping to become professors. And even the more dutiful ones, even after they become professor, the idea is that, and people joke about this in Nigeria, that once you are a professor, you say, I will say this in Yoruba and then I can translate it, that research rogo, meaning research to help with research, more or less. And, but there are some who still do a lot of work. And so, but there's this pressure, apart from the fact that the ratings or the accreditation systems in places like Nigeria or Kenya, and to some extent in South Africa, often require people to publish outside. There's also the fact that there aren't enough of some of these outlets, even on the continent. And even when there are, the kind of ways in which they are formatted and presented do not often address the issues that you guys have been raising. So I'm hoping that there will be a way of addressing these in the sense of what are the different, apart from those two journals, what are the different ways that you imagine that the resources could be distributed in such a way that people do not even have to feel that when they publish in JALA that they are publishing outside, and even if that's viewed to be outside, that it doesn't even, it's not even conceived as a problem or as an issue. I guess what I'm trying to articulate is how to, in fact, begin the process of redistributing these resources through, for instance, ways of generating even reviewers on the continent, right? Reviewers on the continent, and also doing perhaps some kind of work that will, in fact, locate maybe assistant editors or research, because I mean, you look at JALA, for instance, with the exception of a few instances, most of the members of the board are actually on this side. And so that's, I guess, what I'm trying to say. I mean, what resources, what efforts do you imagine in your own specific areas, of really trying to do some kind of change, or at least respond to this question of politics of location? I can go on, but I think that's the question I'm just trying to, I'm struggling with, essentially to get us to generate conversation while we get a few more questions.
Thank you very much, Akin. I'm actually going to ask all our participants to turn on their video and to unmute themselves in seeking to respond to the question that Akin has asked. I have a couple of thoughts, but since I was the last person to speak, I am going to call on others to on the roundtable to share their own response to the questions that Akin has articulated. Becky, do you want to start? Because you were the first person to bring up the question of location.
Yeah, I could. I mean, the issue again is one's got to understand location in its multiple sort of meanings and also implications. I think the point has been made that if one's speaking about the global South, again, one needs to understand the kind of different ways in which it is constituted, even where that idea comes from, because sometimes I even, worry and I think, okay, now there's theory from the South. What's the implication that there was no theory, in those locations called the South now? So are we again sort of, belated arrivants, and this paradox is actually more serious when one detects them in work that's wanting to do so-called decolonial work, or wanting to do, sort of transformation and so on, because it's like a persistent, and I don't think it's a kind of a historical amnesia, but I think it's ways in which power again plays itself out, and these things have been said over and over, that some of our foundational writers from, across centuries have been engaging in these works in one way or the other. And how do we keep on shifting them into these new boxes in ways that, again, do not speak to either their original context and intentions, which obviously have changed, and how do they speak to contemporary issues? So location, South Africa is very different from the rest of the continent. We still have a couple of very sort of functional, journals that are very regular and do have some significant status. Our university presses are under a lot of strain at the moment, so we've got to find ways of, again, how do we support those and sustain them, not from any kind of parochial nationalist census or anything like that, but again, in terms of this kind of global context. So yeah, and just something on that I think it's interesting as well, is that even for me, the challenge is how do journals, let's say JALA, for instance, with a very clear kind of mission and vision and concerns about both, not only the continent, but sort of work that emanates from across sort of the globe. How does it become, in a sense, part of a productive, generative, and even kind of progressive space in which all these issues are dealt with in ways that advance, sort of scholarships and so on. So the composition of editorial boards is important. I think the composition of the cohort of reviewers that you have at your disposal becomes important as well. So there are layers that one needs to look at in order to move beyond, critiques, which in a sense the verdict has been in for decades, because we've been here before in these debates. So, what do we need to do to both creatively start to make differences that matter?
Thank you very much. Juliana would like to say something.
Yeah, I just want to make a plea to scholars on the continent. There are many scholars on the continent that when one contacts to review articles, they are very gracious about it and they do it and they would agree to do it. But there are also many scholars on the continent that one contacts to review articles and they just say, I don't have any time to do it. I understand that, but I'm still making this plea because if we want to diversify the number of reviewers that we have for articles in journals that publish African cultural and literary studies, we need reviewers, from the continent as well. And so this is not a critique, it is just a plea to colleagues on the continent. I've had many times when I've contacted colleagues and I just say, I would love to do this, but I don't have the time, Like I say, I understand that, but if we want our journals to have a balance of reviewers, over here and also on the continent, we cannot change that balance if many more of our colleagues that we contact on the continent don't say yes to reviewing articles. This is just a plea on my part. That's it.
Thank you very much, Juliana. We do have a few questions that have come in. But before I start going to those questions, and I still expect the other people on the panel, Tom and Adeleke, yes, to respond to the main thing. Yeah. So I'm going to allow you to do that, and then I will go to the questions that have come in. Yes, Tom.
Yeah, I mean, this. Sometimes I think about these issues, and it's like the good old joke, right? That you're not likely to drink the best coffee in Nairobi, and most likely in Basel, in Geneva. You're not likely to get the locally produced best chocolate in Accra. I mean, maybe in New York. I mean, it's just a joke. It's a joke, but it's a very serious joke. So you are studying Africa, right? Almost 1 billion people. Let's make them even 600. Even if you just had Nigeria alone, you're studying Africa, right? So the demand and supply is already predetermined. It's African. I mean, I got tired of going to conferences and people would go on and on and on and on. You know, the people in the global north don't want to publish ours. They will not publish. Of course, like I said before, it's an economy. Like all economies, there'll be competition. And if there's competition, how somebody brands their product and how they undercut you is a fact. It's always assumed that academics are very decent people, that we don't need to talk about these things. Oh, really? Like, can I call on Jesus Christ to save me? No. So let me say something a little bit. I sat down to write the original proposal of the Journal of East African Literary and Cultural Studies because I had argued, why would I want to go to London to attend a conference on African Studies Association of the UK, whose focus is on African literature and culture? First, what am I taking there? What am I going to say there? So we got to work like economists to say the supply and demand is predetermined by African. We got to start to think. So when the East African Literary and Cultural Studies Journal was set up, remember, we were talking about 3 to 8 countries. It's kind of moving on into Central Africa. It's kind of moving on into Mozambique, etc. So we have to work twice as hard to provoke conversations between the different regions of the continent. And we have to say, Achille Mbembe used to say that we can shout all the world cares, but we must create a local archive. The local archive is the foundation of our conversation with the rest of the world. By the way, the numbers of African scholars in the global north compared to the numbers of people teaching in African university is very minuscule. And so are people doing research there. So the question is for us not to continue crying and saying what. So I want to say that, for example, if JALA says that it has a particular focus on Africa at a particular time, let's say they say, okay, we want to look at life histories. I mean, JALA shouldn't be even requesting people. It should send out these and it should be receiving thousands of responses. So the idea here is that those who are on the continent, those of us who are here, the idea is probably to start to say, how do we create the next cohort of Africanist scholars or scholars in Africa, interested in Africa, to produce, to supply intellectual work that will actually feed the demand, both local and global. Pretty much the way we produce coffee here, it's consumed here, yes, but it serves the global market. So I think there is actually energies here to do a lot of these things. What we need to do is that this kind of conversation that we're having right now needs to really be much broadly spread. In fact, like this conversation should next time cue in directly people from the 6, I mean, I always say that Africa has 3 regions, Central, East, West, South, North, and the islands, that we should cue them in. If you add the 7th one, which is the diaspora, we really have a huge market here. So we need to think like economists rather than like just scholars of culture and literature. That's my argument. And that was the real reason why one evening I sat down, wrote the proposal, walked across the office, called my colleague Godwin Siundu, who both of us had been taught by Adeleke Peterson at Witwatersrand. And we said, from what these guys do in South Africa, we can do it here. And then lastly, a small point, I think there's interesting magazines, magazines coming out from the continent that are doing a bit of public intellectual work, but they're also doing a significant thing. They're creating an incredible archive. So we need to tap into that. Those networks have got very good editorial skills, but also good research backgrounds. I think that's what I wanted to add on to that conversation.
Thank you very much. Because we are, we don't have too much time, I want to read the questions that have been, a number of the questions that have been submitted. And then maybe later, Adeleke will also want to add his own piece on the politics of location. So let me read some of the questions that we have thus far. One person asked, how do editors or reviewers respond to theories or fields that they are not familiar with? And I'm going to read all the questions at once so that you can have them at the back of your mind. So that's one question. Another question, what is the difference between applying a theoretical framework and a conceptual framework? We've used that interchangeably, and I think that probably goes to me. Another question that we have is the subjectivity of the peer review process a myth? Or I don't know whether the person meant the objectivity or the subjectivity of the peer review process a myth. How do the different protocols of journals shape peer review? I'd like some responses to those questions. And I'm probably going to start with Leke in asking him to take a stab at one of those questions. If you need me to repeat them, let me know.
Thanks. I can read them here. I saw them in the chat as they came up. Let me start with the end. The last one on objectivity of peer review process. It's not a myth. I do not believe it's a myth. I think people approach this work with a lot of conscience. At least I can speak from those I know, and I've been doing this for a long time. I'm sorry if that dates me, but it's not. People don't do that with malice. They approach it. They don't. Many of them don't even know who the writer is. They don't. So let me say one thing. I was in grad school. He's an eminent scholar. He's a Victorianist. I was his office wearing sad face. He said, "Leke, what's wrong with you?" I said, somebody just rejected. He said, "Oh, that's a problem? Is what they say right in the peer review?" I said, "I've not read it." He said, "Why you go and read it? If what they say is right, correct it, send it to another person. Send it to another place." That's what attitude. You are not being a jankara. You are not just a market woman. That's not the market woman mentality. That's what Tom Odhiambo said, economic attitude towards it, which when I say market woman, I meant that seriously, that you balance your interests with your desire and choose how to pursue it. So I think, in short, I do not believe it's a myth. I do not believe it's a myth. Then on location, everything is, Tom, I like what, I can kiss you on the screen for what you say, but I cannot. Regarding putting in the work, I wish others were like that. Honestly, I wish they are. I agree completely. So I'll let others tackle others.
Let me take the opportunity to say a few words as well before I call on the others on the roundtable to speak. One thing that Juliana mentioned is, in speaking about the politics of location, is how difficult it is to get reviewers from the continent to agree to review an article. Now, our colleagues based on the African continent are working in different conditions. In some places, salaries have not been paid for 6 months. There are infrastructural challenges, electricity, unreliable access to the internet in other places. Still, having said all that, we cannot create a more fair system without the buy-in of our colleagues on the African continent and elsewhere in the world. We need your input. I would say, speaking from the point of view of the Journal of the African Literature Association, sending out invitations to review. Obviously, people are busy. And of course, this year is a terrible year, right? 2020 is just a terrible, terrible, terrible year. Having said that, the majority of the people who have declined to review or who have not even responded to my request are based on the African continent. So rest assured, as authors, we are doing our best to find reviewers around the world, located in different places, but we're not always successful. So this is an appeal to colleagues. If you are in a position to review and you receive that invitation, please consider accepting. I have had some accept, but not enough, I think, to make for a fair process. In response to the person who asked the question about the objectivity of the peer reviewer, of the peer review process, that's why many journals require a minimum of 2 reviewers. And sometimes when the 2 reviewers have reviewed, if they disagree, we will send the article to a 3rd reviewer. The peer review process is not a science, it's an art. It's not an exact process. The best you can do is to try to receive different perspectives. And sometimes when I'm in the position of actually requesting review, I will deliberately say, I'm writing to you to review this part of the article because you have an expertise in this area. And I'm writing to this other person to review this other dimension of the article because they have a different area of expertise. So, you know, one hopes that reviewers, that the editors in a journal are trying to diversify the review process and the kinds of people they ask to review an article. Someone asked, let me quickly respond to that before going back to our panelists. How do editors or reviewers respond to theories or fields they're not familiar with? This is the job of the editor. The editor is not supposed to know everything. The editor is supposed to then go out and find reviewers who have published on a specific area. So I may not know, I may not have expertise in the specific area that this author is asking about or would-be author is asking about, but I will look for who can do that. I will look for reviewers who can do that. Someone has also pointed out that we've used the, I've used the term theoretical frame and conceptual frame interchangeably. I have indeed used them interchangeably, you know, and I don't think we should stress too much about that. There are known, let me call them named theories that have names, which you can deploy, but there are also concepts which have not arisen to the level of being called a theory, which you can also use. The important thing is how you apply whatever it is to the work. How do you apply it to the text, to the body of work that you are considering in your article? Because if you're just, as going back to something Becky said at the beginning, if you're just being descriptive, that is not something that is enough to, it doesn't give us enough reason to want to actually accept an article. The article has to engage in some kind of analytical work. And in order to engage in that kind of analytical work, you will need a theory or you will need a concept. So it's the application that is really the important, thing. Akin has added for us to note that the creation of Manuscript Central is another issue. Maintaining a database of reviewers means that once you input your details and successfully review a manuscript, you get more submissions, which can become overwhelming. Thank you for mentioning that, Akin. That is very, very true. So actually, I don't use Manuscript Central and those things to look for reviewers. I just go to Google Scholar and other databases and look for reviewers from scratch, because you don't want to keep going back to the same reviewer over and over and over again. In fact, there was somebody based in South Africa that reviewed an article for Jala recently within the past 6 weeks. And we needed to find a reviewer for another article for Jala, and someone suggested, and I said, no, I'm not going back to that person until next year, until 2021. Maybe late 2021. That person has already assisted us. We don't want to overwhelm them with all kinds of requests and asking them to do things over and over again. We have a few minutes more. Let me just ask all our panelists. So what can senior scholars, intermediately positioned and senior scholars do to rectify some of the imbalances that we see, just as individuals? Akin brought up the question of institutional culture. And institutions need support. They need financing. Many universities across the continent are public universities. They're government-funded universities. They're severely lacking in resources. They don't have funds. That's the reason why many of our journals are now attached to, big publishers, multinational groups overseas like Taylor and Francis, Springer, and others, Elsevier, we're attached, Intellect, we're attached to that. In this moment that we find ourselves in, what can we individually, whether we are based on the African continent or we're based in Europe or North America, what can we do individually to try and rectify the imbalances? We have only 1 or 2 minutes each to speak. Please, our panelists, if you want to say something, any last words that you have. Adeleke, do you want to say something? Please unmute yourself.
Okay. I like the Tom Odhiambo model, if I can name it that, the model of knowing what is needed on the continent, starting some initiative and bringing in other people. These things will not develop on their own without resources. I've been invited to positions. I mean, when I don't mean work, I mean like journals in Nigeria, but I have a full-time job here. If you are not going to give me graduate students over there to help, or colleagues to act as people who help me actually process the papers, it's going to be difficult for me to do. But as we said, resources are needed. Give people, I would advocate that editors be given teaching relief, like course relief, before you accept to start a journal or to edit a journal. Ask for concessions from your institutions. And I'm appealing to those who are in positions to do that. Please grant them time. Grant them, it doesn't have to be money. Give them opportunity, give them grad students, give them, and rank these, use these for promotion criteria as service. If you're an editor of a major journal, that should be your service. That should be enough as service. Don't expect other things to do. In other words, they shouldn't be unremunerated. When I say remuneration, it doesn't mean in terms of salary. It also means resources and opportunity. Without generation, without the Tom Odhiambo approach, we will keep complaining and complaining and complaining.
Thank you very much. Juliana, do you have some last words for us, very briefly?
I would say that junior scholars on the continent should not shy away from reaching out, to scholars here, for help. I mean, there are so many articles that are submitted to journals that I think if someone had just had the time to look at it just once, they would have told this person, no, you can't submit this. Do this, do this, do this before you submit it. So they shouldn't shy away from seeking help from senior scholars. Let the senior scholar be the person to say to you, I don't want to do it, I can do it. More often than not, that senior scholar would actually propose and say, why don't you reach out to this other person? So it's the idea of creating networks of collaboration. Mm-hmm. And junior scholars, if you're waiting for a senior scholar to come and ask you to show them your work, that's not going to happen. Those senior scholars are busy with their own stuff. So you have to take the initiative to reach out to the other scholars, and I think many of them would be happy to lend a hand, to mentor, and that's important. Create those networks. You have to work at it. I mean, you don't have a network if you don't work at creating one for yourself. Thank
you. Thank you very much, Juliana. Becky, do you have some last words for us?
Yeah, only just to emphasize the need to actually embark on sort of specific, sort of interventions and projects. As I said earlier, sort of the verdict has been in for a long time. So it's what kinds of both relationships do we form on the continent, solidarities both on the continent and abroad elsewhere, just to consistently work at these kinds of challenges in ways that, in a sense, affirm us when we see even that we are able to take small steps, but that we're not stuck where we were complaining 10 years ago. I think for me, it's not to underestimate what one can achieve through consistent application.
Thank you very much, Becky. And Tom, last words?
The logic of academic work in years gone used to be that it was a labor of love. But I mean, that's that's possibly not true in some of these contexts. But I can swear that unless those of us who actually say very proudly when we go for academic conferences that I'm an African studies person, unless we deliberately find ways of creating networks, and the internet, you know, the internet makes that very possible. Creating networks, and you don't now need to print a journal, it just needs to be an e-copy. But I tell you, to get out one volume is a lot of works. It's a labor of love. So we got to create networks that taps into, there's lots of young scholars who have a lot of energies. What they need to happen is that they need to be raised. You know, if you kind of think about it in the evangelical way, you have to raise their face to look up into the sky to see the Lord. I imagine Juliana is saying that, oh, if there's a scholar down here in Nigeria, Ghana, Kenya, they can write a senior scholar in the global north. Just always remember that a lot of these younger scholars have been brought up in a regime of intimidation. You know, you saw your professor and you said, hallelujah, Jesus Christ is around the corner. No. So I think this conversation, this one, should actually become part of a larger, broader trigger to start conversations about how do you actually create network systems that tap in. Just a database saying the following number of people on the continent are approachable, they can be approached, and they can create a network system. It doesn't have to be another organization, but kind of a consistent thing that triggers every 2-3 months. It says, are you aware this is happening? And we would want to be involved in this conversation. I see a lot of this with the young people on WhatsApp, on Instagram, on Signal, and they create. My students in film studies are constantly creating because they're actually tapping into those networks. That's what I would say for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you to all our panelists. I'm going to hand over to Akin Adeeko to end the event for today.
Okay, well, thank you again. This is really energizing and actually forward-looking, and I feel personally gratified by the way in which it's ending. The idea of looking forward and really giving people confidence is really quite what we need, because there's obviously a great deal of need and desire for people to get it right. So thank you very much. This is really quite generous on your part, Moradewun, for opening things up, and really, because initially we wanted to talk about the book that you edited last year, the handbook, but you know, it's okay. It's really quite good service, and thank you for making these, opening things up and really giving people opportunities that will ordinarily not be available in this format. So thank you. Our next event is next month. I think it's on the November 23rd, 21st actually. It's going to be something similar to this. A group of two scholars who actually have published a fairly provocative piece called Africa Literature is a Country. And then we'll have a few responses to that. And so we'll have something of a panel and respondent format going forward. And so that's what we're going to have. And again, it's going to be here in this format. And we hope that you guys will join us again. It's been quite a ride, and we're also very gratified that people are queuing in from different parts of the world. That's an indication of our reach and also of the kind of need that we serve. And we also hope that those who are listening and doing making all these inputs will actually consider joining the association, so that the benefits will flow both ways. So thank you very much, and have a good rest of your day, whether it's morning or night, wherever